I am Steve Dale here of the Dale Law Firm, and what we're going to talk about is special needs trust and really trying to focus on special needs trust somewhat as an advocacy tool. We're going to cover a lot of focus on the nuts and bolts of putting a special needs trust together, some of the big issues that come up when you're setting up a special needs trust, including choosing a trustee and what the process is. The second part of this, we're actually going to go through our process here at the Dale Law Firm of setting up a special needs trust. So as you're going to see, we're going to go through how do you fill out the intake sheet, what is the process that we use, and also what do we charge. So with that. Also, just as an aside, for those of you that are watching, we are doing a whole series of programs coming up on all sorts of different subjects. I believe our next subject is going to be limited conservatorships. Then we have another one coming up on how to do a court accounting. So once again, if you are interested in being on our mailing list, if you email Shelley, SHELLEY, at DaleLawFirm.com, she'll make sure she puts you on our mailing list. The other thing I would suggest to you here is if you'd like to know when the new videos come up, because we do all sorts of videos, not just these workshops. If you go to our Achieving Independence YouTube channel and hit subscribe, and hit notice on it, you will get notices as we put up new materials. I think we have something like 192 videos right now here. So once again, if you want to keep up with what's going on, that would be the way to do it. Now, a lot of what we're going to cover today here comes from our guide here, which is the Special Needs Trust Guide. For those folks that are here live, you actually have a copy of it here. This is what it looks like. We will also make sure that the folks that are watching online will have access to at least the chapters I'm going to talk about here. And what it's really meant to do is what this workshop is all about, is to have a step-by-step guide to assist people with disabilities, families, and advisors to how to establish a special needs trust and make sure that you not only set up the proper trust, but you can actually understand how the thing works. Here. So the first thing as we go through this in chapter 2, we're going to talk about the challenge that we face when we're trying to plan for a person with a disability. And that's going to define a lot about, how we do our planning. So, when somebody is asked to describe the purpose of a special needs trust, the typical answer given is to protect eligibility for public benefits, things like SSI, Medi-Cal, and that kind of thing. And it's not that the benefits aren't important, but I think all too often people really focus only on the preservation of the benefits, and they kind of miss the big picture here. And the big picture here is that we really should be focusing on quality of life for a person with a disability. And there's many times where maybe foregoing some of the benefits makes a certain amount of sense. And there's times when it certainly wouldn't make sense. So, that's part of a good special needs trust, should do a lot more than just keeping somebody on a welfare program. Okay. So I always like to illustrate it this way. And for many of you in the audience, maybe this wouldn't be that difficult for you to imagine. But imagine that you have a daughter named Kathy here, and let's say she's 17 years old. Now, by the way, I use Kathy all the time. Kathy has had every disability under the sun. Today, let's assume that Kathy has autism. To my knowledge, nobody has ever died of autism. So here's the thing that comes up. You come into the law office, the Dale Law Firm or some other lesser office here, and you come up and set up one of these special needs trust things for your 17-year-old daughter. And as always, people say that, that immediately after you get everything set up, let's say you're hit by the bus or whatever it is, and you pass away, although in our office nobody dies, your trust matures here. And so the trust actually goes into operation at that point here. And so our challenge is going to be here that if Kathy has a disability and she's going to need assistance for the rest of her life, here, in all likelihood, she's supposed to live until she's 87 years old. So just imagine the challenge in this situation is that this trust is supposed to provide for this young lady for 70 years. Can you imagine the challenges we have when we're setting up a trust to provide for somebody for that long a period of time? So here's just some of the challenges we might have. First off, I have a video which I will send, and I will make sure it's posted on YouTube, and I'll make sure that everybody who's attending gets a copy of it on the basics of public benefits. And that video runs about 30 minutes, and it goes through all the ins and outs of SSI, all the ins and outs of Medi-Cal, and all the other programs. But how many of you people think that our public benefits system will stay the same for the next 70 years? And the answer is it will almost certainly change here during her lifetime, maybe many, many times. So if all we do is set up a special needs trust that is focused only on preservation of SSI and Medi-Cal according to the rules today, we haven't done our job. So we need to make sure that this trust is going to be able to adjust to almost anything that might come up. Okay. The other thing is that if Kathy has autism in California, in all likelihood, she's going to be eligible for regional center benefits here under the Lanterman program. Now, so we would be supplementing the services she's getting from the Lanterman system. Okay. But here's the problem. There are many states who had similar programs that have long since fallen apart. Here, and there is no guarantee that the regional center system is going to continue for the rest of Kathy's life. So if the regional center system does continue, and by the way, I'm a great fan of the regional center system, but realistically, it's not very well funded, and there's been many times in the last couple of decades where we almost lost the entitlement and would go to a waiting list system like almost every other state. So there's no guarantee that's going to continue. So the other thing we have to look at is not to assume that services will be there for the rest of Kathy's life. Now, if Kathy has schizophrenia, as far as I can see with California's system, the only way is up at this point, because the services that are provided for folks with mental illness are pretty sad in California. But the thing is, it's not static, and we can assume things are going to change over her lifetime. Here's the other thing. One thing I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on is that the choice of trustee for the special needs trust is the single greatest issue about whether or not this thing is going to work or not work. Okay. There's a thing that I like to talk about called the magic document syndrome, which is somehow the attorney's going to create this document and it's going to resolve every problem that Kathy could possibly have. Now, how absurd is that? Okay. And not that we don't write really good documents, but the document is only as good as the people that are managing the trust and making the decisions and all that. So the choice of the trustee is the single greatest issue in our experience about whether this is going to work or not. Now, here's the problem. Can I name a trustee that I know is going to be able to give the quality of services here for Kathy that she's going to need for the rest of her life? And the actual fact is, absolutely not. Okay. And we're going to talk about corporate trustees. We're going to talk about private professional fiduciaries. We're going to talk about pool trusts, and we're going to talk about individuals. But the thing we have to look at is to make sure we have a system that's going to be able to adjust, because trustee options and trustee availability is going to change. And that is just a fact of life. So going through this, when we're using this as an advocacy tool, disability tends to be a life-changing experience, okay? Not only for the person with the disability, but also with the family themselves. Part of the experience of caring for somebody with a disability is advocating and securing resources. So for those of you that are in the audience, you're giving up a lovely afternoon to come listen to an attorney in his office here. And so you must be an advocate for a person with a disability, or you wouldn't be here. It's the same thing for those of you that are watching online here. And the thing with it is that in a lot of cases it has changed your life. Okay. And it maybe has changed your life in ways that you don't even realize. And in a lot of cases, providing for a person with a disability is kind of a learned experience, and it develops over time, and it's not intuitive. So you may think that family are sharing your experience and sharing your values and that kind of thing. And the fact is, in many cases, that's not absolutely true here. So by necessity, family members often become quite adept at navigating the disability service and benefit system, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of your family and friends, or even siblings here of your child with a disability, are sharing the same experiences. So this is one of these things that, as we're working on, especially on who's going to be the trustee, we need to be really cognizant of that and try to put together a system that makes some sense. So now, I'd like to introduce a gentleman who had a great amount of influence on my life. His name is Ed Roberts. He passed away in 1995. I write about it from time to time, and I was one of Ed's many proteges here. And Ed was somebody who had a very severe disability here, and he used to talk about disability all the time. One of the things he used to talk about is that the disability community does not discriminate. It will accept any of us at any time. So I know with a lot of the families I work with here, what I hear is that I want to set up one of these special needs trust things. So if I died, as if you're going to get out of this thing alive here, I'm going to make sure my child with a disability is provided for. But here's the tougher issue. What if you have a stroke? What if you have some sort of catastrophic injury or something along that line, and you become disabled yourself? You actually become part of the disability community. Then, part of good planning should really involve, in that kind of situation, what kind of instructions are we looking at giving the trustee to make sure that that they can make some pretty difficult decisions about how to allocate your funds, unless you have unlimited funds, and I have very few clients where that's actually true. Now, here's another way to look at it, and this actually comes from a book called Loving Trust. Now, it's not a book about special needs trust. It's a book about a philosophy of estate planning. But their definition of estate planning is, I want to provide for myself and my loved ones during my lifetime, and upon my incapacity or death, give what I have to who I want, the way I want, when I want, and if I can, save every last fee, tax, or court cost possible. I have this in every one of our conference rooms. We get a lot of the clients who will point to this and say, that's exactly what I want. They're usually pointing at the cost part here. But if you think about it, good estate planning isn't just passing on things when you pass away. It's also making important decisions about how to allocate your assets during your lifetime and upon your death, and giving instructions about how that's going to be done and who's going to be in charge. So when we're planning for incapacity, we're really looking at striking a balance. Many families that have a loved one with a disability are balancing their needs with the needs of their loved one anyway. That's what families do, okay, here. But good estate planning should reflect on the values of the grantor. The grantor is the person who establishes the trust or the plan by leaving instructions to the trustee about what factors should be considered in maintaining that balance. Okay, so for instance, if you were to have a stroke, a well-written plan here should have provide the trustee with clear instructions on what to consider when providing for your needs, as well as the needs of the rest of the family, including your child with a disability. Okay, I'll give you an example. My wife and I have sons. They're not technically disabled, and we're told that someday they're going to be able to support themselves. That would be great. But if you know my background, I grew up in institutions, and I'm kind of terrified of institutions. And our plan, basically what it says is, if there is a choice between leaving money for my children and taking care of the two of us, we're going to be perfectly fine. Okay. For a lot of the families we work with, they're not able to be that cavalier. And so oftentimes what you want to make sure that you communicate is that in that kind of situation, how are we going to do that balancing act? Where do we want our trustee to put their focus here, especially if we're talking about the quality of life for a loved one with a disability? So, talk a little bit about special needs trusts and where they came from and what a trust is to begin with. Special needs trusts weren't developed by Social Security here. There were a number of folks who developed it across the country, but it was based on these rules as we go through this. Okay, so the Social Security Administration defines resources for an SSI recipient as cash or any other personal property the individual owns or has the power to convert into cash, or is not legally restricted from using for his or her own support. For SSI and Medi-Cal has essentially the same rules, and so does IHSS. You cannot have more than $2,000 in resources on the first moment of the first day of the calendar month. Now, if you watch the full video on the basics of public benefits, you'll see some exceptions, but that's basically the rule that we deal with when we're talking about SSI, Medi-Cal, and in-home support services in California. Okay, and so the issue that comes up is that if you leave funds directly to a loved one who's on those benefits, they'll immediately get dropped off of their SSI, Medi-Cal, or IHSS, and they'll lose those services. So if an SSI recipient doesn't own the asset outright or is legally restricted from directing access to those funds, those assets are not considered a resource for public benefits purpose. And that's where the special needs trust came from. So a special needs trust, in fact, let me back up a little bit. All trusts are contracts. That's all they are. Okay, so there's all sorts of different types of trusts. There's living trusts, there's charitable trusts, there's insurance trusts, there's family limited partnerships, there's all sorts of different trusts. And all a trust is a contract that's supposed to achieve some sort of a result. A special needs trust is a contract where the trustee, the person in charge of the funds, has sole and absolute discretion over the assets in the trust, and the beneficiary has virtually none. When you have a trust, a contract where the trustee's holding those funds and they have full control, and the person on SSI, Medi-Cal, or IHSS has no control whatsoever, you can put any amount of money in that special needs trust or assets, and they'll still stay qualified for benefits. In essence, a special needs trust is a form of a spendthrift trust. A spendthrift trust is a type of trust where the trustee has absolute discretion here, and the beneficiary has none. By directing the assets that are otherwise intended for the individual to a special needs trust, you're preventing those assets from being counted as an available resource, and you're preserving his or her eligibility for benefits. Now, let's just stop for a minute. Anybody got a problem with that? Now, for many of the families I work with, the objective might be to make sure that your loved one, your child, doesn't have control of the assets. But let's go back to this. Let's assume for a minute that Kathy is perfectly competent, and were it not for eligibility purposes, you would have no problem whatsoever having her manage the funds. The fact is that in this situation, and this is true for all special needs trusts, the trustee has absolute discretion and the beneficiary has virtually none. Okay, as we start talking about trustees, trust protectors, advisory committees, and all that, we're going to talk about how to mitigate that. And this is one of the reasons why we need to customize many of the trusts we work on. So as we're setting our objectives here, proper planning should focus on achieving as much independence as possible here. And benefits should never be the sole planning objective. And it's not to say the benefits aren't important, but really we should be focusing on quality of life. So now you'll notice in this slide, there's something in it that says SI space 01120.200B13. Okay, what the heck is that? if you've ever called Social Security, does it seem like they're reading a script? They're reading a script. And the script that they're reading is called the Program Operation Manual System, or the POMS. What the POMS are, and many of the videos I do will have POMS sites, and we'll talk about POMS. What they are is they're directions to eligibility workers about how to handle one situation or another. So this comes from a POM site, and if you were to Google SIO1120.200, you would probably go straight to the Social Security website, and down the line you probably would go to my website too, because I quote this POMS all the time. So here's what the POM says. A supplemental needs trust, which is a different name for a special needs trust, is a type of trust that limits the trustee's discretion as the purpose of distributions. This type of trust typically contains language that distributions should supplement but not supplant sources of income, including SSI and other government benefits. And almost all special needs trusts will say that. Now, the trust that we do will actually say, will give the trustee the ability to say, if there's a choice between quality of services here and preserving benefits, a good example with that would be Denti-Cal, okay, which is a dental program under Medi-Cal. Now, I'm sure there are some really fine Denti-Cal programs out there, but I haven't found one yet. So I know that a lot of the beneficiaries we work with, even though they might be able to qualify for Denti-Cal, it's not unusual that the trustee will go ahead and pay for a real dentist to see the person anyway. So that's an example where, yeah, maybe there's some services available, but if we make it, if we widen the discretion a little bit, then, you know, once again, our focus is quality of life, not necessarily squeezing every last dollar out of the government. So today we're talking exclusively about third-party special needs trusts. So the POMS goes on to say that a third-party trust, and what a third-party trust is an estate planning trust. That's what we're talking together. Sometimes you'll read about what's called a first-party trust, which isn't really what we're talking about today, which is when somebody comes into money on their own and sets aside their own money in their own trust. And so what we're going to talk about will be helpful. But what we're talking about is when a family member or a loved one sets aside money for their loved one with a disability. So a third-party trust is established by somebody other than the beneficiary as the grantor. Okay. As they say, it could be established by a grandparent to a grandchild. As we'll talk about later, I have a niece here named Erica who has a disability here. So it could be a aunt and uncle for a niece. It could be a parent for a child. It could be a brother for a sister. It could be a child for a parent. Okay. But it can't be the person with a disability setting up for themselves. That is a different kind of trust. Okay. Third-party trusts have great latitude here, so you can have multiple beneficiaries in one special needs trust. You can have trusts that terminate. You can have trusts that turn on and turn off. And when you pass away, or when the beneficiary passes away, you can leave it to anyone you like, except you can't leave it to the drafting attorney because the state bar really frowns on that kind of thing. So anyway, and I'm sure I have clients who would love to leave me something, but if the state bar is watching, we would never take it. Okay, so there you go. So by the way, when we're talking about that, one thing you might want to consider is if there are some disability organizations that have served you or your loved one well, you know, even a small gift to them makes a heck of a lot of difference. Okay, so in Chapter 7 of the guide here, we're going to talk about a 4-step process that we use. So step 1, and the reason we're doing this, and what I'm hoping that this webinar is going to do is that sometimes the process of creating a special needs trust seems daunting. We're going to talk about our drafting staff and how we do this, and we do special needs trust every day. For most of you, this is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and what we want to do is try to work on how can we guide you through the process to make it as painless as possible. Absolutely painless, I don't think is possible, but we want to really work you through the process. By approaching planning on a step-by-step basis here, the experience can be less overwhelming, okay? Additionally, the special needs trust is more likely to meet the needs of the client. And, you should think of this as the job here is that for you as the client to teach Jennifer and her drafting staff, as we'll talk about, what your objective is, what your resources are, what is your goal, what is your objective here. And then her job and her staff's job are to work with you within that and teach you about the possibilities. And from all that, come up with a trust, come up with a system that's really going to meet those objectives, and ideally something that you understand. Now, I will tell you, for those of you that are clients, here our trusts are large, they are huge, and some of the boilerplate is almost impossible to understand. And I have a master's in tax, and it's a challenge for me. But the main part of the trust, getting past the boilerplate, it really should be clear what is the objective and what is it you're trying to accomplish. So let's go through the first part of this. Part of this, the first step is to clearly express your intent in your trust and related documents. The second step is to choose a management system to carry out your intent. Okay, we're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. We could have a great trust that's really clear. This is what we're trying to accomplish. We could have a great trustee who's able to manage the trust. But if we don't put something in the trust, it's not going to do very much at all. So then we have to figure out what you're going to fund it with. And by the way, make sure that the plan really is rational here, considering the amount of resources you have that you can set aside. The last part of that is, and I think for those of you that either have a disability or have a child with a disability, your job is never done. Actually, even after you pass away, your job is never done. So part of that is having an update and review process that goes on not just during your lifetime, but also for the lifetime of the beneficiary. So anyway, let's go through the first step. So in this, and once again, we'll make sure that for the folks that are not here in the audience, that we'll make sure that you have a link to all these chapters and maybe more here. So in Chapter 8, we start talking about this. As we had talked about, disability is a life-changing experience, and providing supports for a person with a disability isn't always intuitive. If you're a parent with a child with a significant disability, take a moment and consider how your life has changed. And I can guarantee you are not the same person you were before you joined the community here. So I like to say nobody joins our community voluntarily. We're all drafted in one way or another. But the fact is that there's a lot of learning that's involved here when you're dealing with a loved one with a disability, or if you have a disability. Disability is a life-changing experience, not only for the person with a disability, but also with loved ones that support them. So, one of the primary duties a trustee of a trust has, all trusts have, is to comply with the intent of the grantor, the person setting up the trust. Whenever there's a question, whenever there's a dispute, whenever there's litigation, it all has to do with what was it that the grantor, the person setting up the trust, wanted to do. If you have a bare bones trust, okay, so if you have, I've seen trusts that are at 8 or 10 pages, and maybe for some of our clients, they would think that's a good thing, because believe me, our trusts are a lot larger than that. But a bare bones trust that all it says is, preserve my child's public benefits here really lacks the proper direction that the management team's going to need in order to carry out those duties. Right? Without proper documentation of the grantor's intent, the trustee's not going to be able to understand what your values are. Going back to Kathy, you may have folks who know what your values are now, but eventually you're probably going to have folks that are going to be in charge of this trust who have no idea who you were, or no idea of what your objectives are here, or what you're trying to accomplish. So that's why doing that is so important. The other thing that's really important here to consider also as you're doing your planning is that we're setting up a private social service system. That's pretty much what we're up to. And one of the things the trust can do, especially as we start talking about trustee options, is help to prevent or at least identify abusive or neglectful situations. I would tell you here, if you look at my background, I actually grew up in institutions. I worked in institutions. One of the reasons I became a civil rights attorney and eventually a special needs trust attorney is because I witnessed a lot of abuse in state hospitals here. But to think that that doesn't happen in the community, you're just kidding yourself. In fact, there's an argument that you may be safer in a state hospital than in the community. And so the point of this is that isolation almost always is the situation that we have when somebody is abused. And the single most effective way to prevent abuse and neglect is to encourage the beneficiary to be as involved as possible in being involved in the community of their choosing, and also make sure that somebody visits them on a regular basis. You know, part of the disability rights movement of moving from institutions to the community isn't just physically moving into the community. I would say that if all we do is move people into 6-bed group homes, what have we actually done? All we've done is move people from small institutions to large institutions. What's really important is that they're involved in the community and active in the community. Not only is that good for quality of life, but the more active they are in the community, or if possible, if somebody can come and visit them on a regular basis, that is the single greatest method of avoiding abuse and neglect that I know of. The more your disabled loved one is involved in a circle of support, such as a religious community, social clubs, jobs, neighborhood organizations, the less likely he or she would be subject to abuse. So, for instance, and this is coming from somebody who's barely Methodist here, if your child is really interested in their church, their synagogue, their temple, whatever it is okay to put in that trust that as long as Junior wants to do this, I want to encourage them to be involved with that community. Now, it's not okay to say if they don't believe in Jesus, you don't get a distribution. That probably would get struck down here. But it is okay to say, this is part of my community, this is part of our identity, and I want to continue that. And let's say I was the trustee, you would want to communicate to that you're barely Methodist trustee, but this is an important part of my child's life, my child's culture, that kind of thing. And not only is it good because it puts them in a community, here active in the community, it also is going to help reduce the chance of abuse and neglect. That could be with social clubs. I happen to be a yachter. It could be with yacht clubs. It could be with anything, but let's get back to this. The goal isn't just to keep somebody alive here in a group home or a board and care home or whatever. Part of it is for them to be active in the community as much as it's reasonably possible for them. So with this, you need to clearly state your intent so that in the event there's a future trustee who doesn't know you, didn't know what your objectives are, it's going to be clear what is expected. A bare bones trust only accomplishes limited objectives, and it's going to leave the management team to guess what the heck is it I'm supposed to do. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we do this, and as we go through the intake sheet with you, I'll point some of this out. Okay, a special needs trust, we like to include in the special needs trust very broad information for overall guidance to the trustee and the advocate. And we'll be going through the actual intake sheet that we use here at the Dale Law Firm to show where you might reflect that and then how we're going to transfer that to the trust. Now, you don't want to write a whole lot of detail. You want to make broad statements in the trust, like, you know, is it housing that's important? Is it vocational needs? It may be that your loved one is capable of someday supporting themselves or at least working. And for many persons with disability, working can be the path to true independence. Okay, it might be to protect them from being vulnerable to predators. What is it broadly that you want this thing to do? With that, then we can dig a little deeper into the woods. And we can call this a journal of intent. We can call it a letter of intent. Call it what you like. But this would be a separate writing. It's something you would keep up, okay, which would be a journal of intent, which would give more detailed information. think of it as ongoing documentation of the beneficiary's needs. So for instance, for you parents out there, you know a lot of good stuff that would probably be really useful to the beneficiary, like what kind of doctors work, what kind of medications work, what doesn't work. I have somebody who had a horrible side effect from a decanoate here, which is a form of medications for people with mental health issues here, and she wants to make sure that her child never gets that same medication again because it almost killed them. Here, it may be, what kind of social things they like. And so this is something where the two things can work together. You really don't want to have more than a page or so here as far as in the trust, but we certainly want to put in the trust that broadly this is what we want to accomplish, and then we can get more into the woods with a journal or a letter of intent. So did I mention that the choice of trustees is the single greatest issue? I will tell you, when I first started doing special needs trusts, they were considered fairly exotic things. I even had a hard time getting my hands on trusts. And when I first started doing this work, I would sit down with my clients and we would come to the part where it says, who's going to be the trustee? And they go, well, Uncle Bob. That must be fine to put Uncle Bob's name. And then somebody else's name and somebody else's name and all that. And that worked out really well until I started having clients pass away. And then I discovered that maybe we should pay a little bit more attention about who's going to be the trustee, because, being the trustee of one of these special needs trusts really takes a fair amount of skill here, and it also takes a certain amount of empathy to make this work. So we have been looking for the ideal trustee for my entire career. And so this is kind of the list of what we've been looking at. Keep in mind, the trustee has absolute discretion and the beneficiary has virtually none. Okay, so we want to make sure that that trustee is going to use their discretion in the best interest of the person with the disability, of our beneficiary. Okay, here, and it's going to be able to really make rational decisions for them. Okay, well, that's pretty straightforward. Somebody who's going to understand public benefits and keep up with changes in the law. Now, that's not necessarily as difficult as it may seem. I'll be introducing, at least virtually, Jennifer, my associate, in a minute, and our drafting staff and all that. Now, we deal with public benefits day in and day out here, and I will tell you, I don't think there's a day that goes by that something doesn't come up where we don't know the answer right away, but we know how to look it up and how to figure it out. If you have a trustee who really isn't as knowledgeable about benefits, it's not that difficult as long as they can identify issues and when they need help. But, part of this sometimes is making a decision about when preserving the benefits is important and when maybe it isn't so important. One of the most popular series of videos that we have on our YouTube channel is we have a playlist of videos having to do with housing. And I will say there's a lot of situations where you can pay for housing directly and take a slight reduction in SSI or an elimination of SSI. And that might be the right thing to do, even though you're giving up some of the benefits, because, once again, housing is pretty important. So understanding benefits, understanding the rules, understanding when you need help, and also understanding when maybe it makes sense to forego some or all of the benefits. That's something we want our trustee to do. This is the difficult one. To wisely invest and conform to all statutory fiduciary requirements, meaning here in our markets, we're doing this end of April 2018, and the markets are going up and down and up and down and up and down. Here, I'm the trustee for 250 beneficiaries here, and so, I look at that market every day. So we're up 50,000, we're down 25,000, whatever, here with our accounts and all that. And markets go up and markets go down. But the thing with it is that with the investments, you're supposed to do a prudent investment. Now, what the heck is that? What that means is that you're supposed to invest the funds, but it's supposed to be appropriate for the particular situation, meaning you shouldn't day trade with somebody's assets. You shouldn't put them in risky investments and that kind of thing. You should be considering what their time horizon is and all of that here. And you should also be balancing and splitting up the portfolio here. And so, the problem that I've seen, and this is where having an investment advisor who understands these things could be really useful to make sure that the investments are done properly and that you're not putting things in risky investments and making sure you diversify properly. And also think of it this way. If you have a child, for lack of a better term, a child that is typical who doesn't have a disability and a child who does have a disability, and let's say you take your estate and split it 50-50. If your non-disabled child loses their inheritance, what the heck? They have a lot more options. You lose that money in that special needs trust, there's virtually no way to get those funds back. And that's why having these things invested properly, usually in a conservative portfolio that's really geared for that individual, is so important. And the good or the bad news today is I don't have a lot of time to go through the fascinating world of taxes and special needs trust. We have somebody in the audience who probably does find it fascinating here. But, with a special needs trust, especially with the third-party special needs trust, there's all sorts of tax advantages here. So we ideally want to have something that's going to work with the investment advisor and work with a lot of what's going on and try to get the best tax result that we can here. The other thing is you have to keep perfect books. We are in the 9th region for the Social Security, and the 9th region has been reviewing special needs trust and been reviewing everybody on SSI here. And it's really common that they're going to want to know what expenditures were made out of that trust. Now, if we have a trustee who is who keeps really good books and can answer, this is what the trust was used for, this is how it was paid, and that kind of thing, there's nothing to fear. If you have somebody who's administering the trust and isn't really logging what they're doing, and is just keeping a shoebox full of receipts, that's the kind of situation where we're going to run into all sorts of problems. And the problem is not just working with the Social Security Administration, but, I've had situations where I've had beneficiaries actually become ill from the loss or even the threatened loss of their benefits here. And so keeping those books perfect here is extremely important. Somebody who's going to provide advocacy and prevent abuse. Now, for you parents out there, there's no way to replace a parent who is the advocate for their child. It's just not possible here. But, part of that is most of you are advocates for your child with a disability. And the issue is, what if you're not there to make sure that they're safe and identify situations that look like there may be some abuse going on here? And so as we start talking about care managers and different options, this is something we must always be vigilant, here, especially if we have somebody who's vulnerable. Now, here's the thing that might be difficult for many. Let's say I happen to serve as trustee over 250 trusts for the Golden State Pool Trust. Now, I don't know if I would meet all of these things or not. And I have a team, believe me, my wife doesn't give me the checkbook because I don't believe in check registers, but I have staff who take care of it and all that. So let's say, okay, I think I can do all these things. Now, here's the hard one is you got to be immortal. You got to outlive the beneficiary. Now, I've got a pretty good idea that I'm probably not going to be serving as trustee for 70 years. In fact, I hope I'm not here. So, trying to choose an individual, sometimes even trying to choose an institution. We used, for many years, we used to use A.G. Edwards Trust Company because they will always be here. They were here since before the Civil War, and whoops, they didn't make it through the last investment banking fiasco here. We use a number of professional trustees, but they're just human beings. We use corporate trustees, and we have many corporate trustees that we're very pleased with. But the thing about it is, even a corporate trustee, they're only as good as the people that are working for them and the philosophy of that organization. So whether it's Wells Fargo or Center Bank or Mechanics Bank or whatever, it's not the institution, it's the folks. So like, can I name a trustee that I feel confident is going to be able to provide for Kathy for the rest of her life? And the answer is no. And I have seen many trust companies, and you'll see, I very much favor using professional trustees, but we have to be realistic. My favorite professional trustee 25 years ago was Sanwa Bank. Oh, they did a great job. There is no Sanwa Bank, right? So that's the thing why, we need to figure out how we're going to make this happen. So now part of this is there is no such thing as the perfect trustee. They just plain don't exist, or at least one that's going to be there forever. So part of this is if we kind of look at that list, and if we kind of divide it into different spheres, how you divide it up almost doesn't matter, but part of what we're looking at is setting up a checks and balance system. So for instance, we might take the advocacy things and put them in one sphere, okay, here, which would be talk about using the discretion in the best interest of the beneficiary, making person-centered choices when we're talking about public benefits, or even providing that advocacy. And we may do that and maybe assign that to a care manager. We might take the financial part here and assign that to the trustee and the financial advisor that works with it. And we might do the accountability and put that into another sphere. So what would that look at? And let me say this before we go through this. I'm going to suggest a number of different models that we use. Just because I'm suggesting these models doesn't mean it's the only way to do this. But these are models that we have found that have been working for us here. And when you are hiring a law firm, whether it's the Dale Law Firm or another law firm, don't think of it as just buying a document. That's the product that's being produced. But what you're doing is you're buying the experience of the law office. That's something that I think that we do a very good job at, because all we do are special needs trusts day in and day out. So not only do we set them up, we also, a big part of what we do is advise trustees, and actually for the pool trust, trustee services. And I will tell you, it really helps with the drafting, understanding what works and doesn't work. If you're looking at hiring another office here, or you're in a different community here, if you're looking at hiring somebody, just keep that in mind. You're not just buying a document. You want to ask them, what experience do they have as far as in the administration and helping with the administration of the trust? Do they know the different services in their communities? Do they know the fiduciary options, private professional fiduciaries, corporate trustees, care managers, pool trusts? Do they know that in their community? And if they do, then that's somebody I would certainly want to would give high marks for. So this would be something that we do often. And just think about this. For instance, let's say you're looking at using big bank and trust to manage these funds, okay? And so there are many corporate trustees who do a very fine job. But the idea of a bank being totally in charge of your child's funds without some sort of checks and balances is a pretty scary thing. Once again, they may do a terrific job, and then there could be a change in management and things could change overnight. Generally, what's happening is the trustee is going to manage the funds and make the distributions. Now, in California, we use corporate trustees. We also use private professional fiduciaries here, which is something that they're available across the country, but California has their own licensing, and so we have many very committed private professional trustees. So what they do is they manage the funds, they make the distributions, they do the taxes, they keep the records, they make sure that they pilot this thing so it stays on course. With it, you might have a trust advisory committee, which gives guidance on distributions, can amend the trust if laws change or replace the trustee. I have learned the hard way. You must always have a way to replace a trustee here for any number of reasons. It may be that maybe the trustee isn't doing a decent job, although usually when you're unhappy with the trustee is more than happy to resign and let somebody else in. It could be that there are some better services going down the road. Okay, so you may have somebody who's doing a terrific job, but there may be some new trustee or agency that comes along that will do a better job for less money. And why would you not want that? Okay, because this is a changing and evolving system here. So by having an advisory committee, which would normally be made up of families and friends here, then you can have the ability not only to amend the trust and make changes as laws change, but also to hire and fire trustees here if their performance isn't what they think it should be here. And so oftentimes for siblings, this is a really good way to have siblings involved without having to deal with all the day-to-day administration. With that, they might have a care manager. Now, what a care manager is most care management agencies are focused on seniors. Okay, so you hear all the ads on TV about care management agency. Here, like ones keep mom at home or keep mom in the closet or something along that line, or but there's all sorts of care management agencies out there. Not all of them work with persons with disabilities. But if you go to the care management website, which is aging in place, but I always find it by going to caremanager.org, which will take you to the proper website. You can find care managers, and then as you start looking at care managers, you'll find care managers who also specialize in assisting a special needs trust with benefits issues, mental health issues, developmental disabilities issues. So what these care managers are, they're private social workers, marriage and family counselors here who actually focus on trying to assess what the needs are for a person with disability. Now, there's a difference between care management and caregiving. So most of what they're doing is they're assessing needs and trying to find services. And I will tell you, the care managers we work with bring something really special to the table here. The other thing they can do is oftentimes we'll put in the trust that if nobody is visiting the beneficiary, if nobody's visiting Kathy on a regular basis, we will have the care manager go and visit from time to time, because once again, isolation equals abuse. Okay, so that's terrific. Now, with that, the next model is very similar, but we're going to use a different animal. Now, once again, for those of you who know my background, I was actually a psych nurse for 17 years, and my father and grandfather were psych nurses, or the equivalent here. And so I worked hands-on with folks with mental health issues and that kind of thing, and have somewhat of a passion for it. It's very common, for instance, when you have somebody with a mental health issue, that there may be some compliance problems and that sort of thing. And we've had some situations where having an advisory committee can be problematic, because if you have somebody who's not compliant and ask for the trustee to do something here, that if they don't get it, they'll hound the advisory committee until they get what they want. So sometimes what we want to do is maybe change things up a little bit. So in this case, we might have the trustee who's going to manage the funds, make the distributions, do the taxes and all that. The care manager, and for many of our mental health cases, I like to put the care manager on the front row, partially to protect my trustee, because I want the care manager to be involved with the beneficiary when there's needs and really be able to assess what those are, amongst other needs. So they may do that and advise on what the distributions are. We still want to have our checks and balances system, so we might have a trust protector, which would be a single person usually. Here, it could be two people, but it's usually one person. We're really going to limit what they can do to replacing the trustee, making amendments to the trust, and that sort of thing here. And if you think about it, if the trust protector ultimately can replace the trustee, they're in ultimate control. But what we don't want them to do is to be involved in the day-to-day administration of that trust, if that's the situation we're facing, because once again, we may be in a situation where they will just drive the person out of their mind. And what we want our beneficiary to do is to be laser focused on their own health and welfare, and whenever there's an issue, to go through the care manager or the trustee, depending on how we've got that set up. Now, for most of these trusts, and if you sit down with Jennifer and her drafting team, one of the things you want to look at is she's going to go through with you, the assets that you have and what your objectives are. And she's more than willing to talk to you about whether or not what you're trying to do here is realistic. So whether or not what you're doing is realistic. And for whatever reason, we are not recording. I need to just check something really quick. No, we're still on. Okay. Sorry about that. Those things happen. Okay. So so for a lot of the professional trustees, you're usually looking at trying to leave at least $250,000, maybe more. Now, this is one of the reasons why the life insurance industry really loves special needs trust, because it may be that you just don't have that kind of money. And it's very common that maybe you're going to buy a life insurance policy or whatever to do that. Let's say you would love to buy a life insurance policy and leave $500,000 to your child, but maybe you're not insurable and the costs are just out of whack. And let's say instead what you're probably going to do is to be able to leave your loved one here a house and maybe $100,000 on the side to make sure that the roof doesn't leak. In that case, we might want to really narrowly tailor what this trust is going to do here, and be really specific that in this specific situation, our focus is going to be on maintaining that household for my child here, and that she might have family members as trustees in that situation here, and you might purchase the advisement you need as you need it. So a lot of the cases, I will tell you, for all Californians here, providing housing is the biggest issue we deal with, second to nothing. Here, for a person with a disability, it is a huge issue. And I know for a lot of folks we deal with, just having a safe place to live in is half of the game right there. So in that sort of situation, we might talk about a limited purpose trust. Here's one other model that we use here, and this would be a special needs trust managed by a pooled trust. Okay, so let me go back to this. What a pooled trust is, it's kind of a cross between a 401k and a special needs trust. The traditional use of a pooled trust, and I happen to be the trustee of the Golden State Pooled Trust. The traditional use of a pooled trust is you sign a joinder agreement, you sign a contract that basically says, I'm setting aside this amount of money, and pooled trust, I want you to take care of my child just like any other trust. Now, the nice thing about pooled trusts here is that they're sharing their resources between hundreds, sometimes thousands of families, and so you're spreading your costs across that. Some of them can include care managers and advocates, and one thing that we're working on, and we have been doing a series of programs on, is developing a new system called working on the life passage planning and all that. So they may have all sorts of systems of advocacy that would be help with your advocacy and carry out your intent. The problem with doing it in the traditional way is that if you do it through a joinder agreement, rarely is there a way to pull those funds, especially after you've passed away, from one trust to another trust. And just kind of a basic truism here is that you want to leave as many choices as you can whenever you're planning for a person with a disability, and you don't want to box yourself into a corner. Believe me, I've learned that the hard way over time. So what we're suggesting, and we actually have a video on how to do this, whether you use the Golden State Pooled Trust or you use the San Diego Community Trust or any of the other pooled trusts out there, is to create a separate special needs trust, and then that trust put in that it would be managed by the Golden State Pooled Trust, or a private professional fiduciary, corporate trustee, or or pooled trust of the advisory committee or trust protector's choosing. That gives us the best of all worlds. You get the benefit of using the pooled trust, but if for some reason there's a better option out there for your loved one, you'd be able to move it from one place to another. For those of you that are interested in pursuing that further, there is there are some videos on administration of special needs trusts on our YouTube website on how to use a pooled trust to administer a special needs trust. Now, here's the thing as we finish up. Our prejudice is towards using professional trustees. Now, have we seen it where family members have done a good job? We absolutely have, okay? Although usually the biggest problems have been well-meaning but unprepared family members who take this on. If you want to make a loved one, a brother, sister, sibling, or whatever, the trustee, my suggestion is to put in the trust that something which I call the I told you so clause, where if it gets to be too much, that they can delegate it to somebody else, or a private professional fiduciary, corporate trustee, or a pooled trust of their choosing, or have some mechanism with that. The other thing with it is that let's say you want to try using a family member anyway. You can take your revocable living trust here, maybe put a few dollars in it, and let's say what you want to do is have the sibling of your disabled child be the trustee here. Well, have them practice while you're alive and see how it's going. Have them deal with the day-to-day issues. Test it out here. Maybe they will do the most marvelous job in the world, and maybe they won't. Okay, but once again, I just want to end this segment on the choice of trustee is the single greatest issue about whether this trust is going to work or not. The trust is setting up a system, what I like to call a private social service system, but it's setting up a system about how they work together and all that. But in the end, it's not the document, it's the trustee. Not that you don't want to get your document through us. So, two quick things to go through, and then we'll go through what's involved in actually the process of working through our office for those that are interested in going forward here. So the next step is going to be funding your special needs trust. So consider a trust as the vehicle, the trustee as the driver, and funding is the fuel to help the special needs trust make its goal, right? So with that, here, one of the biggest mistakes we also see in estate planning is not properly funding your trust, which means making sure that all the assets that are being set aside for your loved one with a disability, either make your trust or your living trust or the special needs trust the owner, or make it the beneficiary. We've seen many people set up these trusts and maybe purchase a life insurance policy for them, but name the person with the disability instead of the trust itself, and that just causes no end of problems. The same thing with retirement plans and that kind of thing. If you're working with an investment advisor here, and if the investment advisor is going to be helping you with your planning, and in many cases maybe help with the administration of the trust after you've passed away, a good investment advisor is going to be doing more than just selling you stocks and products and that sort of thing. A good investment advisor is also going to be involved in reviewing the things you own and make sure things are titled properly. The last of our steps before we go through a whole process here is update and review. As I mentioned, for loved ones here, especially parents who have a loved one with a disability, your job is actually never done. That's just the way it rolls. Okay, so a question I get all the time here is, how often should I have my child's special needs trust reviewed by an attorney? Okay, and this is a real common answer for attorneys. It's a catch-all. The answer to everything is it depends. Okay, so with that, as unsatisfying as that response may be, the following information may have further guidance for you. Now, one of the things I will make sure that you folks get in the link that we'll send you to some further materials is an article that I wrote for the Special Needs Alliance, and Jennifer and I are both members of the Special Needs Alliance, here. Called Updating Your Special Needs Trust, begin with a self-review. The other thing that we'll send, and it's on our YouTube channel, is we have a self-review. Not only do we have the self-review in our guide, but we also have a video on how to review your special needs trust and also how to review your living trust. And my suggestion is pick a date here where you're going to review it. So, begin with an annual review, and you may undertake yourself with the assistance of your financial or tax advisor to help you with your overall financial planning here. Once you've performed this self-review, this self-check, you'll be able to determine if now really is the time to update your estate plan or your special needs trust, okay? We haven't gone through anything major for special needs trust for some time. We certainly have with living trust, where today our estate tax exclusion is north of $11 million. And the vast majority of my clients have much less than $11 million. So we're not as focused on estate taxes as we are. Now, if you have more than $11 million, then yes, we do need to pay more attention here. But part of this is pick a date. It could be your child's birthday. I have somebody who reviews their trust on the day that they signed the trust because they said they'll always remember the day they wrote that really big check. Okay, so if that's what motivates you, that's fine. But, to do that from time to time. And what you'll see in the materials about the self-check is it's going to be asking you questions like, has there anything changed in your child's situation? Has your financial situation changed? Maybe when you set up the trust, what you had set up made a lot of sense, but maybe your assets went up or maybe they went down and maybe you need to make some adjustments. The biggest things we change more than anything else is who's going to be the trustee here and who's going to be the remainder beneficiary here. So let's finish the rest of this, and we're going to go through this fairly quickly, is our process here for drafting special needs trusts. Okay, so this is how the Dale Law Firm does it. Other firms do it somewhat differently. The reason we like doing these workshops is that you'll be better prepared when you actually sit down with the attorney here, and hopefully you've been thinking now about trustees and all the different issues we're dealing with, so you can get right down to business when you sit down with Jennifer and her drafting team. Let me mention something about Jennifer. A lot of folks always want to work with the principal of the law firm. That's me here. And, in this situation, Jennifer does almost all the drafting. Now, Jennifer, all she does is special needs trust. She's either drafting every day or going to court. She's well published. She was George Miller's disability assistant here when Congressman Miller was in place. She worked as a lawyer doing access law. She has a sister that she talks about quite frequently with a disability here, and she has a lot of practical experience. So I know a lot of people think they want to work with the principal. I'm here to tell you, you're better off with Jennifer, and she's a lot less chatty than I am too, so you'll probably get done quicker. Okay, so here's the process we're going to go through, is filling out the intake sheet before the appointment, okay, and trying to get it to Jennifer and her drafting team so they can identify some of the issues they're going to want to address with you. Meet with Jennifer and sign the representation with the 50% initial payment. Then after we do that, what we do is we send a draft of the trust here for a review, and we'll go through what does that look like, and then sign the final document and pay the final fee. That's it in a nutshell. But of course, let's dig a little deeper. So this is something we'll make sure that everybody has access to. This is our intake sheet, but just going through it very quickly. The first part of it is, of course, we need to know who you are setting up the trust and that kind of thing, the basic information. We need to have information about the beneficiary, who they are, when they were born, that sort of thing. Or if they have children, if they're married, that sort of mundane information. On the next page, we're looking at, were they disabled before the age of 22, because we're trying to identify whether they qualify for a special program for called childhood disability benefits. Are they conserved? Do they require supervision? Do they have substance abuse issues? Are they developmentally disabled? And if so, are they getting regional center assistants, or anything else that would be germane to their needs and their strengths and their challenges. Then we're looking at what assets do they own. Okay, so we're trying to identify if we have any issues along that line, and that's pretty self-explanatory, as well as what benefits they're on. Now, if you don't know what the benefit is, you're probably not getting it. So, for instance, GHPP is for folks with hemophilia and sickle cell. So, if you don't know what it is, you're not getting it. Don't worry about it. Okay, so once again, we work with a very broad group of folks. The next page goes through what we had talked about is defining what it is we want to say in the trust here. So there's a couple of key things we have. Residential is always number one on our list. So what kind of residential situation do you think would be good? What would not be good? Here, what kind of residential situation would you want to support? Or is it even an issue? Here, social and recreational things. What kind of things does the person enjoy? What motivates them? Once again, we get back to, are they involved with churches, social clubs, that sort of thing? What is it we should be encouraging? Dealing with family. Oftentimes we want to encourage them to continue to be involved with family. And so what kind of supports? Other things that I often see in here is education. Here, what kind of education would you want to support? What kind of vocational needs would you want to support? So what we're looking at is, once again, trying to get an overall picture of what your objectives are and what you want the trustee to accomplish. And that's certainly not inclusive. Then we're looking at other assets that are owned by the beneficiary. So that would be, like real property, automobiles, savings accounts, and that sort of thing. When we get to trusted individuals, we purposely don't ask you who should be the trustee. Now, if you sit down with Jennifer and her drafting team and say, I want my daughter to be the trustee, that's what's going to happen. She's going to talk with you about different options and how we might make that work. But what we're looking at is, who should be involved in your child's life and what are their strengths and their weaknesses. And sometimes this will help trying to figure out, would an advisory committee be good? Trust protector? What should we do here to meet your loved one's specific needs? If there are changed circumstances, you may have a situation where the special needs trust makes sense, but if they were able to achieve certain milestones, like for instance, for many of the trusts we do, especially, it's very common for folks with mental health issues where they'll do very well for a long period of time. But being realistic, if you have a severe mental illness, the chance of a relapse is very high, just being realistic. So it's like a checklist. Like if my child is not dependent on benefits, is able to be substantially gainfully employed and earn funds, if they're not subject to undue influence, just whatever that checklist is. We might want to say that the trustee, in that situation, you can, in your discretion, or you can with your advisory committee or trust protector agreeing with it, you might want to start just giving cash right out to the beneficiary rather than put it in full special needs trust mode. In most situations, it's not a good idea just to undo the trust here, because being realistic, you may have problems in the future. But at least by doing that, once again, our goal is not to make your child dependent on this. And if they're able to be self-supporting here and don't need the protections of the trust here, that's a good thing, and we want to be able to reward that. Then the other thing, and this is something you really want to focus on. Jennifer was sharing with me today that she's amazed at how many people come in and they haven't put any thought about where the funds go when the beneficiary passes away. So you might want to decide where it's going to go. Now, in some cases, you can actually allow the beneficiary themselves to decide. In fact, today, I had a beneficiary that passed away here, and they had exercised what's called the power of appointment, and they decided where the funds could go when they pass away. Here, you might want to put in, if you're going to divide it amongst children, how do you want to divide it here? But, think about where you want it to go when you pass away. Just a little plug here. if you've been served by the ARC or by NAMI or any of these other organizations that advocate for the welfare of our loved ones with disabilities, consider leaving just even a little bit to them, because they'll be able to do magical things with those funds. Okay. The next step here is that, okay, you get it all filled out, you send it in, we set up an appointment. Jennifer will meet with you either in person or by phone and answer any questions and design your trust, okay? The majority of our clients actually come in person, but we have clients all over the state. So if you don't want to come to beautiful Pacheco, California, which is really Martinez here, we are able to do this over the phone. You will be asked to sign an engagement letter defining our scope of services, and our normal way of doing this, unless you make other arrangements, is we will tend to take half up front here and half when we're done. Here, she will work with her drafting staff and complete the initial documents here. So most of you will get to know Lysandra, who does the majority of our drafting. She's a paralegal here who has an enormous amount of experience doing this thing for review. Now, as far as that is concerned, this is an example of our representation agreement here. So what we will tend to do is we tend to flat fee these things. I don't know if you're able to see this, but where it says payment of fees, we almost always will, or things that would increase our fee, we always will put in a number. It's usually a fairly high number that if we go over a certain a number of hours of legal time, that we have the option of going on hourly. And the reason for that is, quite frankly, we can't spend 20 or 30 hours on a particular trust. It would just, there's a certain point where we just have to bring it to an end here. So that's what we call the engineer's clause, because engineers just can't help it. They want to tear this poor thing apart here, and they want to understand every word. Now, as far as the review, this is an example of what you might get. We use the Elder Council and Wealth Council Special Needs Trust forms, which I am actually the author of those trusts here. And what we do is there's a lot of boilerplate in that trust. Now, it's not that the boilerplate's not important, but these are very broad trusts that are used for all sorts of different situations. So it may very well be there's a lot of clauses as far as powers in the trust that may not apply specifically to your child, but it's best to have all those clauses in there, because you never know what's going to happen. What Lysandra and Jennifer do is they highlight the sections that you should really focus on, and we really suggest that that's what you focus on. And if you think about it, what we want to focus on is this stating your specific objectives that you want for your child. Did we spell their names right? That's kind of important. Do we have the right people in as trustees? Do we have the proper checks and balance system? Also, those key parts of the trust, we want you to be able to understand what they do and how it functions to get us our checks and balance system. Believe me, reading a 40-page trust top to bottom is something that I don't think is that useful. We want to help you focus on what it is you need to focus on. You will review the trust draft with Jennifer here, and most of that's done over the phone. Okay, so normally what they do is that Jennifer will go over the draft with you here. Jennifer or I will go over the draft with you, and we'll review it. You'll come up with all sorts of questions. It's very unusual that you don't make some changes, because these are very personalized trusts, and we want to make sure that it reflects what your needs and wishes are. Then the last part of this is, after it's done and we're clear that the trust has been drafted properly and is ready to sign, we'll set up a signing date. Now, once again, the vast majority of our clients come in and sign the trust here, but it can be signed remotely as well. So we have clients across the state. So if you're in Bakersfield, it may be that you don't want to drive all the way up here just to sign a trust, and that's something you certainly can do remotely. Let's go to the last part of this, and then we will open this up for questions and how we do for time. Not too bad. Here is that this is our fee schedule. here. So our normal fee for just a regular special needs trust is $3,000. But if you attend the workshop, either watch it in person or watch it virtually, then what we do is we reduce the fee for $500. And I'll tell you, we have found that folks who watch the workshop and are better prepared, we're going to spend less time with them, and we want to pass that on to you here. Now, if what you need is a revocable living trust here, usually what we'll do is we charge $3,000 for the revocable living trust here, but we actually have a package which I'm not sure is reflected here as far as what that is for and I'm sorry to be. So we normally charge $3,500 if you're single, and we're doing a revocable living trust and the special needs trust. And that includes titling one deed into the trust. If you are a married couple, our normal fee for a revocable living trust and special needs trust is $5,000, but we charge $4,500 here if you do it as a package and if we do it at the same time. Okay. Now, to confirm current fees, contact the Dale Law Firm because these fees could be changed at any time. We're taping this in 2018, so if you're watching this in 2020, almost for sure we will probably raise our fees between here and there. Maybe we'll lower them. You never know. Okay, so it's whatever the fees are at the time. With that here. Just to mention real quick, we have a number of websites here. We have the Achieving Independence website. We have the Dale Law Firm website. And we also have our YouTube website, which is youtube.com/C/Achieving Independence. And so if you would like to look at our other videos, and I will make sure that the folks that are here and the folks that are watching get a link to a number of to materials here. We have a plethora of materials on that website. With that, here, Amy, do we have any problems any questions? In fact, why don't we start in the audience here? Are there any questions here? Yes, ma'am.
Would you take the MetLife benefits that I have through my employer?
The question was, do we take MetLife benefits? And there's a number of benefit programs here. We'd have to take a look at it. It really depends on the program. And I forget there's another one that's really popular, which we've never been able to work with because they severely limit what you can charge. And the problem is we just can't work at that. So it really depends on the situation. So if you do have a legal plan, you would need to check with us. Yes. There's a question here. Is there a link to purchase of the book on the website? And there is, but I would actually suggest that if you are interested in the book, you call the Dale Law Firm at 925-826-5585 here, and they can help you, or email in this case, Shelley, Shelley, at DaleLawFirm.com. For those of you that are watching, I'm going to make sure that the chapters that we covered are going to be available to you virtually. So we basically use the guide to help folks that are, walk through this process to be better understand the whole process. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What do the advisory committees and the corporate trustees charge annually to do their job?
Well, advisory committees are usually family members, and they can charge, they usually don't. Although, corporate trustees will tend to charge somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. There may or may not be additional costs for the money management, so you're going to have to really check into that because I know one corporate trustee that charges 1%. here, but then there's a money management cost on top of it, which probably puts it more in like 1.5, 1.75. Wells Fargo, for instance, charges 1.3%, but they don't charge for money management. So sometimes getting apples to oranges is difficult. Well, it would, depending on and most corporate trustees do this based on the amount of money managed in the trust. The other part of it is private professional trustees will tend to charge hourly. The average is probably $125 an hour. Here, care managers are anywhere between, they range anywhere from $100 to $170 an hour. The average is probably about $130, $140 an hour. And then for those of you that are watching here, we're starting to utilize a program, which I'm not going to talk today, called the Life Passage Planning Program. So stay tuned to that here. And this is using disability organizations who serve folks with disabilities and hiring them privately. And the going rate for them is somewhere around $60 an hour. And so, part of it is, and that's a good example about how things are changing here. We have a question here, which is, how long does it take to get an appointment? And let's go back to the lawyer's answer. It depends. Right now, the turnaround is pretty good, and it probably within a week or two is real possible. I know we were backed up about 4 to 6 weeks a while back, and that's the longest that I've ever seen here. So right now, I think the turnaround is pretty good right now. We really try to do our best to turn these things around in 4 to 6 weeks. Part of that being that if the process goes on and on and on, it just really inhibits the learning process. Once again, the goal is not only to do a document specifically for your loved one with a disability, but ideally something that you understand, or at least understand the key parts of that. Do we have another question in the audience? Phil?
So, Steve, I always appreciate your communication style. It's very understandable. However, my eyes aren't good enough to read some of the slides that are on here.
Yes.
Are they available on your website?
Are the slides available on the website? And I'll make sure that they are here for, because I would have a hard time reading them too. And the other thing that we'll do is the ones that are probably hardest to read are the ones having to do with the intake sheets, and those will be made available too.
And this may be too much of a question for today, but you talked about beneficiaries owning assets, and I wonder if there are some cases where they should and some cases where they shouldn't.
Well, the question is that, are there cases when a beneficiary should own assets and when they shouldn't? So let's take a good example, housing. Housing's biggest issue we deal with. On all of the programs, a benefits recipient can own a home they live in of any value. Now, there are times when it probably makes absolute sense for the beneficiary to own the home. But the problem is, if you leave the home to the child, as an example, and for some reason here they're not able to live in that home, if they sell the home, it's not part of the trust. In most cases, we're actually going to suggest that the trust own the home itself, but it really depends on the individual. But there are exceptions to that rule as well. Usually automobiles will be owned by the beneficiary themselves because, for one thing, we don't want the trustee to have liability if there's a problem, but we might have the trust own a lien on the car just to make sure that if it's sold, it can't be sold. So it really depends on the capacity of the individual. And so even with my prejudice that it's usually best for the house to be owned by the trust, there's huge exceptions to that rule, and it really depends on the individual. Yeah. Okay, here's another one. Can conservatorships be discussed at the same time, or are the two not related? Interesting question. And the next video we will be doing will be on limited conservatorships. Now, this is, we have folks who will come in and do absolutely everything, the conservatorship, the special needs trust, and all that here. And depending on your situation, that may work out fine. Rule of thumb here, that may be a lot to tackle at one time, and you might want to tackle one thing at a time here, just because, once again, you don't want to get overwhelmed but you certainly can do both. My suggestion is if you're moving that direction, when we do our program on limited conservatorships, you'll get to meet Terry Millich, our paralegal who focuses almost exclusively on conservatorships along with Jennifer here. And it's often a good idea to talk to them and see if you have a situation that's pretty straightforward. Maybe tackling both of them is fine. If it isn't, I would do one at a time. Here, do we have another one from the audience here? If not, they're very busy out there in YouTube land. Go ahead.
I was wondering, I was told I am the disabled person.
Or the person with a disability.
Right.
Yeah, people first.
Okay. I have money from my mother who passed away.
Yes.
It's MetLife. And I was told after 30 days of receiving it that I would have to pay taxes on the money, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so I'm actually at 34 days or whatever, and I'm wondering, is there like an urgency to actually forming the special needs trust? I mean, I can see where I could save money if I had done it before the 30 days.
Yes. So here's the thing. We have a young lady in the audience, or at least young to me, here that inherited some money straight out and is on benefits. And the question was that when does she need to set up? And this would be a self-settled trust, right? Similar to what we talked about, different. And we can send, if you give us your information, we'll send you information on that. The benefits go, if you're talking about SSI, Medi-Cal, or IHSS, they go by calendar month, not 30-day month, calendar month. So ideally, to minimize loss of benefits, you want to get it taken care of the calendar month you can get your hands on it, okay? And we have some materials that can help you with that. So when you're dealing with benefits that go directly to the benefits recipient, when we're talking about SSI, Medi-Cal, and IHSS, you go by calendar month. If you're talking about Social Security disability, childhood disability benefits, Medicare, it doesn't matter. And that's where you would want to go back to our YouTube channel and watch the video on the basics of public benefits, because these rules are very confusing and you want to make sure that you don't apply the wrong rules. Otherwise, you're going to put yourself through a lot of bother and cost unnecessarily.
So I was kind of wondering, when is the money considered received? When the check is cashed or when you get it?
No, it's when you could get it. So let's say you got notice from the insurance company that you could get the money now, but you wait 2 or 3 months here because you're trying to figure out what the heck to do. And that's really common here. And what will happen in that situation here is that if you put it in a trust, or even if you spend it down, you have to report it to Social Security. And there's a really good chance they're going to ask you, well, when could you have gotten it, right? And they'll want to get some information about when the person died and when you might have been able to get your hands on it. If you could have gotten it 3 months earlier, you may have 3 months of overpayment. So the sooner you take care of these things, the better. For those of us that are watching this, really focused on third-party trust, that's one of the reasons you want to make sure it all goes in to the special needs trust, so your loved one doesn't have to race around trying to get one of these things set up. So anyway, if you mark on your blue sheet that we'd like to talk to somebody about a self-settled trust, we'll be happy to do that for you. Here's another question. If I have a home with equity but not enough money to pay the balance, can the money go into the trust if it had to be sold? I have 2 grown sons with disabilities living at home with us. Yes, you can transfer it into the trust, and also whether it's going to be sold or it's going to continue. There's a thing called the Garment-St. Germain Act that if you're leaving it for the use of a family member, you can also continue. They can't call the mortgage in most situations here. The nice thing about it going into the trust is that if it did have to be sold, then the money would go into the trust. Otherwise, we'd have a settled situation And in this situation, I don't have all the details, but if you have 2 grown sons with disabilities, that house could be maintained for them. But we would want to make sure we have the proper supports to make sure that the roof doesn't leak and that sort of thing. Also, for those of you that are looking at leaving housing for your loved one with a disability, if you are interested, there's a thing called the Lanterman Housing Alliance here, which likes to work with folks in those situations, especially if there's any possibility that you might, and it's called legacy homes, that you might want to leave that home after your loved ones pass away for other persons with disabilities. Here, just something to put out there.
How do you spell Lanterman?
Lanterman. So it's the Lanterman Housing Coalition. So in our area, we're in Contra Costa County. Ours is the Housing Coalition of the East Bay here. The nonprofit we work with Golden State Pool Trust is North Bay Housing Coalition. There's these coalitions all over. Jeremy says I skipped his question. Okay, so we go back to this. Okay, Jeremy, that's a good question. Here says, if our daughter is 5 years old, is it too early to start and prepare a special needs trust? I get this question all the time. When should I do the special needs trust? Now, normally it's when children start turning 18 because you become interested in benefits and that kind of thing. The real answer is you should get the trust done and funded at least the day before you pass away. So if you, so Jeremy, if you could tell me when you're going to pass away, we got this thing nailed for you here. So realistically, the issue is, let's say, God forbid, you and your children's mother passed away here, and you didn't do anything. The funds would go into a guardianship of the estate, and your county would be involved in managing your children's funds. And I'm just here to tell you, the county managing your funds is the very worst choice of all here. So that's something you would want to take a look at. So did we? I'm kind of going back and forth, Phil.
Are there some assets that should go into the trust and some assets that should not?
The question is, are there assets that should go into the trust and there's some that shouldn't? I have a hard time thinking of assets that shouldn't go into the trust. The things that get tricky are things like retirement plans, which is more than we can get into today. But a very popular way. And if you look at our website, we have a number of videos on funding a special needs trust, and they all cover leaving a retirement plan, a 401k, STIRS, PERS, IRAs, and that kind of thing. Here, and oftentimes that could be a really good thing to leave to a special needs trust, but you need to have an advisor and ideally a CPA who understands what are called accumulation trusts, because they're fairly involved. On the other hand, you can get some outstanding tax benefits by leaving a retirement plan. Past that, there probably is something you shouldn't put in the trust, but I'm having a hard time thinking about it. The only other thing that does come up from time to time is automobiles here, where we normally wouldn't put them in the trust, but we might hold the lien back. You had a question, and then I'll answer yours. Yes?
Yeah, I was told your IRA could not go into it.
Oh, absolutely not true.
Yeah.
Absolutely not true. And if it wasn't 4:40 and we're going to end at 5 o'clock, I'd go into it. But no, absolutely,
But it can go into the trust?
It can. You can make the trust the beneficiary, okay? But what you have to look at is who's the remainder beneficiary, who gets it after your loved one passes away.
Oh.
And this is where, and so if you're looking for an advisor who understands that, I'd be happy to work with you on that. The thing with it is that in many cases, by doing that, you can actually shift the taxes to your child with the disability, oftentimes writing them off. There's the thing called the Qualified Disability Trust Exemption here, and also your child may have all sorts of deductible expenses. So depending on the situation, If you have like a retirement plan and a life insurance policy, the traditional thing is to leave the life insurance policy to the special needs trust and the retirement plan to the child who is not disabled. There's situations where you should do exactly the opposite. Here, give all that nice tax-free money to the child who's not disabled and take all that taxable money, run it through the trust, take care of them. And we've had many situations where no taxes have been paid at all. That really depends on your situation. Here.
My question is,
Yes, go ahead.
Mine tied into that. I was just wondering, like, if you put your house in the trust now,
Yes.
does that change your tax?
If you put the house in the trust now, does that change your situation? Let's broaden the question. Okay. When should you put your assets in the trust? For the most part, unless there's some other reason to do it, you shouldn't put them in the trust until you pass away. Okay. The reasons we put things in trust beforehand. Now, you might keep it revocable and put something in the trust. For instance, if you wanted to use it as a training tool for a child who was going to serve as trustee and see if they're able to do it or not. For the most part, the reason we put things in the trust is for some tax advantage. There wouldn't be a tax advantage with the house or with for asset protection or for high-end tax planning. In the vast majority of the cases, the house will go in the trust after you pass away. There are some exceptions that are covered in some of our YouTube videos, but for the vast majority of the cases, the assets go in after you pass away. And it kind of becomes your alter ego. I will take that gentleman's question, and then I'll take a couple here.
Assuming that all the assets of the trust are funded by an inheritance, are the distributions taxable to the beneficiary?
So the question is, if this comes from an inheritance, are they taxable? In most cases, no. They wouldn't be taxable for estate tax purposes unless you're talking about an estate that's like $11 to $22 million. So let's assume that's not where we're at. If what they inherit is stock, for instance, that you owned here when you pass away, there's a thing called the step up in basis, where basically what it does is it sets it so there's no capital gain, so you can put it in, and as you sell it, the only gain would be the gain after you pass away. If you were talking about a retirement plan, whoever gets the benefit of those retirement monies, they get to pay the taxes. So life insurance is tax-free. So we'll go back to the age-old attorney's answer. It depends. Okay.
But the beneficiary of the trust is the owner of the assets at the time they go in the trust, right? It's not considered income when it's distributed.
No, this is what's called, and we want to be careful not to go too far down this road. This would be called what's called a complex trust. Now, that doesn't make it any more complex than anything else, but that's something that financial advisors, attorneys, and CPAs, they know what I'm talking about. It becomes its own entity. Okay, so what happens is the funds go in the trust because we're talking about a third-party trust. As the distributions are made, there's a thing called distributable net income. So the example would be this. Let's say the trust bought the beneficiary a car, and they're allowed to have one vehicle of any value. Let's say the car is $30,000. Okay, let's say the distributable net income is $10,000. So there's $10,000 of income that has been earned, realized from that. So you pay the $30,000, buy the car, give the car to the person with the disability. Now, for benefits purpose, did the beneficiary get cash? And the answer is no. Or did they get income? And for benefits purposes, income is cash or something they're not allowed to have. So they didn't get income. Did they get taxable income? Oh, you betcha they did. Okay, because they got the benefit of the car, and that $10,000 is going to fall right to the car and end up as $10,000 on their tax return. There's all sorts of deductions, and there's a pretty good chance that that beneficiary is not going to pay taxes anyway because they're in a very low tax bracket, probably have deductible expenses, and there's this qualified disability trust exemption. But this is one of these things you want to make sure the trustee understands, because there certainly is a tax element of that, which usually will work to the benefit of the estate, but it really depends on the situation. And these things are modestly complex. Okay. So going back to, I think this the person who has two persons with disabilities. Oh, do I need two trusts if I'm married and have joint assets with my husband and also have separate property assets? Can you prepare both trusts? Is there a conflict of interest? Oh my goodness gracious, there's a lot there. Here. There's all sorts of ways of doing this here. If you're married and have joint assets with your husband, and you have separate property, you can draft one trust that holds that separate property. My suggestion usually is if you have significant separate property, that you have it in a separate trust. It just keeps it nice and clean. Here, you could conceivably do it with a joint trust, and this is something that you'd want to work on. Yes, we can work with both parties. Here, we would have to sign a conflict statement, but here's the thing with it, is if we were serving both you and your husband or wife here, anything they tell us, we have to tell the other person. So if it's something starts off with, don't tell my wife, it's like, don't say it, because the problem is, then we have to tell them. So now in my situation, I have no separate property. And after being married for 40 years, I can't keep a secret from her anyway, so I wouldn't be that concerned. But you need to really look at the situation. Also, just as an aside, the number of folks who often get divorced is a very high number. So let's say you're in a different situation, that your mom and dad are divorced. If you have we have a lot of families that are divorced who have a child with a disability, and they work very well together. In fact, you really wonder why it is they got divorced, because they did such a good job. And in that case, we can represent both of you, and doing one trust works. If they're not getting along here, then you want to do two separate trusts and that sort of thing. Let's see. We have a home with equity, but not enough. I think I covered that. I think I did. Is there anyone who cannot be legally named as a trustee? Well, you'd have to be over 18. I can give you a whole list of people who shouldn't be. I'm actually not clear if there's a legal impediment here if the person is competent. There's a huge list of people that shouldn't here if they're not able to manage their own personal affairs, if they're not able to set limits here, if they're not good with funds. We might, this is one of those things you'd want to work with Jennifer and her team, because you might have somebody who has, and this is one of the reasons we don't ask you who should be the trustee. You may have somebody who really shouldn't be the trustee, but they may have things about them that would be really desirable to be. Maybe they're a good advocate for their brother or sister, or there may be the opposite. You may have somebody who's very good with finances and all that, but isn't really a people person. This is why we kind of get a list of who should be involved in management of the trust here, and then do what we can to fashion this around to make sure that we're doing something that makes sense. There's all sorts of different ways of putting this together. Amy, I'm going to rely on you to see if I missed anyone else here, but otherwise, in the few minutes we have, Phil, you had one other question?
I don't have a question, but to the question that you brought up earlier, I hear that all the time when people are trying to fund their trust, their living trust, their revocable living trust. And in those situations, they don't put in their retirement plan, and they don't put in their insurance policy, because those are by contract and they name beneficiaries. So there's no need to put them into the revocable living trust, which is different
That make it a
from what Steve
beneficiary.
was talking about, which was the special needs trust.
Special needs trust. Okay.
But you need to do something, because if you don't do something, the fallback is going to be your heirs at law. And if you have a child who doesn't have capacity or is going to have a benefits issue, the worst thing they can inherit is, for instance, a retirement plan. That's the very, very worst thing for tax purposes, benefits purposes, and that sort of thing. So that's where you really want to work it
So
through.
you should have just a beneficiary on your IRA.
Yeah, well, theoretically, you can't get away without one, but I've seen IRAs without beneficiaries, which just shocked me. But you need to, this is where you need to work with your investment advisor or your CPA or whatever to really look at, not just for special needs purposes, but for other reasons. Who's going to be the remainder beneficiary? Because there's all sorts of consequences here. Once again, we use qualified plans, retirement plans a lot. And in the right situation, they can be a great tool. In the wrong situation, you can cause a whopping tax. And it's one of those things where everybody's situation is different. So with that, I think we're pretty much done here. And I have a date at the farmer's market this evening. So that's another motivation. I want to thank you all for coming. If you have further questions, you certainly can contact us. For those of you that are interested in an appointment, once again, we can make appointments. If you have some burning question, like you would love to get started, the goal is not to answer every question you have, but there may be some really key things you need to get taken care of before you're ready to go ahead and sign up and go through this process here. And so the goal is really to go through that and do that as much as possible so that when you sit down with Jennifer and her drafting team here, that you can get right down to business and make sure that we do something that is specific for you. Please keep an eye on our YouTube channel. Also, if you send us your emails here, Amy will make sure you're on our various mailing lists. As far as that is concerned, for those of you that are watching either in person, virtually, or in the future, I'll make sure there's a link to the chapters in the book that we covered, and links to other materials that will help you in this process. My hope is that my hope is that we've helped you with this today here. And with that, thank you very much.